Good morning and welcome to the public items of the committee's 31st meeting in 2020. Mike Rumbles has sent his apologies, and could I ask all members please to make sure that their mobile phones are on silent. This meeting will be conducted in a hybrid format with witnesses and some members of the committee participating remotely. The first item on the agenda is a decision on taking business in private. The committee is asked to consider taking item 5 in private. This is to allow the committee to review the evidence heard on the implications of Brexit for the rural economy in Scotland session. Are members agreed? We are agreed. Therefore, we will move on to agenda item 3, which is the implications of Brexit for the rural economy in Scotland. The committee today is taking evidence on the implications of Brexit, and we are welcoming, first of all, the Right Honourable George Eustace, MP, the Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and Mark Thompson, the Deputy Director of EU Strategy and Negotiations of the UK Government. I'd like to welcome you this morning, but before I ask the Secretary of State to make an opening statement, I would like to invite members or any members that want to declare an interest to do so now. And I'm going to go to Peter Chapman, followed by Stuart Stevenson. Peter.
Thank you, Convener. I declare an interest as a partner in a farming business in Aberdeenshire.
Thank you. Stuart Stevenson.
I am a joint owner of a small registered agricultural holding from which I derive no income. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Stuart. And I too would like to declare an interest in that I'm a member of a family farming partnership in Murray. Secretary of State, good morning. And would you like to make a brief opening statement of up to 3 minutes?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Manton. And I think the first thing that I would say is obviously negotiations on a future trade agreement with the EU are ongoing. It's no secret that there have been two particularly difficult sticking points, one around state aid and the EU asks in that space, and secondly around fisheries partnership agreements and access to our waters and quota sharing arrangements. So those remain quite difficult areas, but our negotiating team are working hard to try to get a breakthrough and to ensure that we can have a free trade agreement and a future partnership that would take effect from January the 1st once the transition period ends. Alongside that, we've been doing a great deal of work to prepare industry, in particular the meat processing industry and the fish processing industry, so that they are aware of the additional documentation that will be needed for exports. So in particular, the fishing industry in future will need catch certificates, demonstrate that the fish was legally caught, and we have a fish export scheme and an export system to help deliver that. And secondly, export health certificates. And export health certificates will also be needed for the export of meats. We're also working through some of the particular issues in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol, where elements of the official control regime and the EU's SPS regime need to be implemented. So we're working with Northern Ireland on that front too. But broadly speaking, a huge amount of preparation has gone in to ensure that businesses are ready for the end of the transition period. And we're continuing to work to resolve remaining issues, both through the joint committee process on the Northern Ireland Protocol, but also on that negotiation with the EU as well.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. Now, there are a lot of questions this morning, as I expect you can anticipate. And the first question is from John Finney. And I would ask members and you, Secretary of State, if possible, to keep the answers as brief and succinct as possible. So, John, over to you.
Many thanks, Convener, and good morning, Secretary of State. Good morning, Mr Thompson. Secretary of State, on the 4th of November, Scotland's leading agricultural, fisheries and food and drink stakeholders wrote to the Prime Minister expressing fears regarding the continued uncertainty. They had 4 main asks, and these related to tariffs, border disruption for high perishable goods, certification costs and EU labour. And you'll be aware that 70% of the North East workforce in seafood processing are EU nationals. Now, I think colleagues will be picking up these particular issues. Can I ask on the generality, please, how the UK government works with the Scottish government to ensure Scottish interests are represented in the ongoing future relationship negotiations, please?
Well, we work very closely with the Scottish Government and also all of the devolved administrations. And this is done at a cross-government level through there's a joint committee, a joint ministerial committee that deals specifically with the EU negotiations that I think Michael Gove chairs. And I think there's been some 20 plus meetings of that particular forum. But within DEFRA, we also have an interministerial group that meets roughly on a monthly basis and met most recently last week.
Thank you for that, Secretary. Can I ask what engagement you've had directly with Scottish stakeholders from agriculture, fisheries, food and drink sectors, please?
Well, I do speak from time to time with NFU Scotland. And in terms of the SSF on fisheries, we have been keeping them appraised of the nature of the negotiations on fish in particular, and some of the ideas that we have on the future partnership agreement on fisheries. So the Scottish Fisheries Federation have been quite involved in those discussions, and we've taken their views into account as we've taken those discussions forward.
Okay, thank you. Can I refer to two of the stakeholders, please? That's the Scottish Crofting Federation and the National Sheep Association of Scotland. And I want to draw your attention to a press release that was out recently, and it was headed, Scottish Sheep Producers Calling Government to Come Clean. They highlight that the TUPs have gone out, but there's no plan put forward by the UK government and what is to be done to support sheep producers. And of course, Secretary of State, this isn't simply a Scottish issue. 90% of UK lamb goes to Europe. And they also allude in this media release to your attendance at the Andrew Marsh show when you suggested that producers could diversify into beef in the event of lamb price crashing. And they described that as a laughable response. Indeed, the National Farmers Union of Scotland said it showed a lack of understanding of sheep production. Now, we know we'll be facing 50% tariffs, and that could see the market collapse and therefore demand drop. Do you have a compensation scheme ready and waiting? And what support will the UK government make available to Scottish stakeholders to help them prepare for the end of the transition period and ensure they're ready for the new trading arrangements that will come into force on the 1st of January, please?
Well, one of the problems that we all suffer is sometimes people react to what they see on Twitter and attacks made by political opponents on Twitter rather than actually look at what I actually said. And on the Andrew Marr show, what I said is if there were the case that we placed tariffs in both directions, tariffs were placed on UK lamb exports to the European Union and tariffs were placed, for instance, on Irish beef imports, well, then you would likely see a position where mixed beef and sheep enterprises, and I stress that quite deliberately, mixed beef and sheep enterprises might indeed produce more beef and less lamb. And why wouldn't they do that if the price signals were telling them to do so? We have around 7,000 mixed beef and sheep enterprises in the UK. And in a scenario where tariffs were applied in both directions, it is indeed the case that if there was a shift in the balance of production within those 7,000 producers, then the market would start to come back into balance. I never, ever suggested that specialist sheep producers in upland areas could diversify into beef. I'm a farmer. I worked in the farming industry. I understand these things, and that's why I never suggested that.
Well, can I maybe press you on that point, John, there as a representative?
John, sorry. Oliver Mundell's keen to come in, I think, on that particular point. If I may bring him in and then come back to you. Oliver.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to further push on the tariffs. I've supported Brexit I want to see us out of the EU. We're already seeing some of those benefits for upland farmers here in Scotland with LFAST payments able to be restored, something that couldn't have happened in the EU. But sheep farmers in my constituency, but not exclusively sheep farmers across the country, are worried about the prospect of tariffs. They know they've got a good product that has a long-term future, that has a worldwide market, but they're worried about what they're going to do next year if there isn't some support on tariffs. And I just wondered whether that was something the government were actively looking at, whether it's something you were discussing with Fergus Ewing here in Scotland.
Secretary of State.
Well, look, it's very much the case that we want to get tariff-free trade and tariff-free trade on all goods. That is the government's position. We accepted a year ago that the EU were not up for doing any kind of special type of partnership or agreement. We accepted that position from them and said, let's just do a very simple trade agreement similar to the EU-Canada one, where there's a precedent. That's what we've been working on since. Now, obviously, we can't, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And if the European Union are, reluctant or unwilling to do a tariff-free trade agreement, well, then we would, as a country, have to consider what our response to that would be. And we would redouble our efforts to open new markets for lamb in countries like the US and the Middle East. We would pursue a strategy of import substitution so that we could support the expansion of some sectors of agriculture in the UK and displace existing EU imports. And in the interim, there would be things like movements in exchange rates that would help to smooth the passage from one system to the new. So there would be a way of addressing that if there were no free trade agreement. And we have to be ready for the possibility that there might not be one. But if there isn't one, it won't be for lack of trying on our part. And on your direct question about the sheep sector, that is the sector that would be most affected. In fact, most other UK agriculture sectors would see an improvement and a firming in the farm gate price in a no-deal scenario. But sheep would be the exception. The peak export months are typically September and October. So this is an issue that would probably not start to present itself until next June and would become potentially quite difficult next autumn. And that will give us time to monitor how things are going, and yes, if necessary, to be ready to step in with some kind of support package. And we had designed various schemes based on, for instance, a ewe special premium scheme or a ewe headage payment and a slaughterhouse premium, depending on which time of the year such effects would take place. But it's too early at this stage to be able to judge whether there would be any real impacts.
Oliver, there are a few people coming in with questions, so I'd like to go back to John Fiddy and then followed by Stuart Stevenson. John.
Thank you, Convener. Secretary of State, you touched on it there that there could be consideration of a scheme. I was very specific in my ask. Was there a compensation scheme ready and waiting? Because I note the detail of your answers, but I don't think it necessarily takes on board the nature of crofting in the Highlands and Islands, where I represent, where we're talking about income, very modest income, being supplemented by a very modest number of animals, and the implications of them not being beef industry would be significant. Not simply in terms of the implications for the sheep sector, but also population retention in very, very fragile areas.
Yes, well, of course, agriculture policy in the round is devolved, and so there are specific issues around things like crofters and the structure of that. And it's always been the case that through the Pillar 2 schemes, even in the Common Agricultural Policy, Scotland's had a reasonable degree of latitude to pursue its own policies. And it would have even more freedom as we leave the European Union, be able to design policies that fit the Scottish agriculture. The role of the UK government in this, as well as having obviously an overall coordinating role and working with them, other devolved administrations on things like common frameworks. In addition to that, obviously trade is the issue that we lead on. We are working very hard to try to get that free trade agreement.
Thanks, John.
Is there a compensation deal in your back pocket?
We don't envisage that it would be needed until at least next autumn. For the reasons that I set out, that's when the export of lambs take place. The levels of exports, indeed levels of production between the months of January to March are quite low, and they start to pick up around May and June to autumn are the peak months. But in terms of, yes, have we worked out what the schemes might look like? We'd done that 12 months ago.
John,
could you share that with the committee, then, Secretary of State? Thank you. And I'll conclude there. Thank you.
No, John, I'm sorry. I've given you as much leeway as I can. I want to ask Stuart Stevenson to give his supplementary question on that, and then we're going to have to move on to the next question. Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. Secretary of State, you talked about some 20+ meetings that have involved the devolved administrations. Have any of the devolved ministers seen the 1,800 or so page negotiating document that the UK government is using to drive negotiations?
I think probably not the full legal text, but certainly the overall approach to the negotiations and some of the key headline points about where the sticking points lie. And obviously, we're very conscious of Scottish fishing interests. The UK government stands absolutely firm behind our Scottish fishing industry, and leaving the common fisheries policy is incredibly important to that industry, and making sure that we regain control of access to our exclusive economic zone really matters to that industry. So I think it's not the case that the full legal texts, insofar as they've been drafted, will have been shared, because obviously these negotiations are ultimately a UK competence. Well, the purpose of these meetings has been to ensure that the devolved administrations are very much kept appraised and have the opportunity to express their views about the direction of travel in the negotiations.
Thank you. Peter Chapman, the next questions are yours. Peter.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Mr Eustace. It will be important, we all know, for us to be able to trade with the EU, that we will need to meet their standards. So does the UK government believe it would make sense for UK and EU rules for food production and agriculture to remain aligned after the end of the transition period in order to allow that trade to go smoothly?
I don't think it does make sense. And I think what would happen over time is you would start to recognise equivalency of regulations. We clearly start off with a set of regulations under retained EU law that are absolutely identical. But would we want to, in some areas, improve things, change things, make things work better? I think inevitably the case for that is yes, there would be things that you'd want to do differently. I mean, if I give you an example, we know that the specific mixture for anaesthetic gas set down for the slaughter of pigs, set down in EU law, is not particularly good and could be improved upon. We're doing work in this area to identify how we could improve welfare of pigs at the point of slaughter. If we can perfect that, then we will change those regulations. We won't continue to pursue outdated EU ones. And it's also the case that in some areas around potentially things like cisgenesis and a different approach on gene editing, we want to reduce our reliance on chemical pesticides. We probably would want to look at some of those issues and not just slavishly follow legacy EU law. So I think there will be areas where we will want to do things differently, where it will make sense to do things differently, where it will be manifestly in our interest to do things differently. And the way that you reconcile that with a desire to continue to trade with our European neighbours is the same way we do for our trade with every other country in the world, and that's through recognising equivalence and reaching agreements through the so-called SPS chapter of any trade agreement.
Well, I'm very encouraged by that, to be honest, because I think one of the main drivers for people voting to come out of the EU was the fact that we felt that we were constrained by too much red tape you know, too much turning our back on science. So, you know, I have a lot of sympathy with that. And I also feel that in very many cases, we actually lead the EU on environmental and animal welfare issues, and you know, are ahead of many of their rules, as you rightly point out. So to some extent, I'm very encouraged with that. I mean, one of the other things I'll just pick up on, when you were discussing tariffs just before I came on, you were saying that there would be an evenness. Tariffs on imports and tariffs on exports would be at the same level. That's slightly different from what we heard previously. So are you saying that that is the case if we don't get a deal, that we will impose tariffs on imports at the same level as there will be on exports? Because I think that's a very important issue for the farming industry.
Well, they wouldn't necessarily be at the same level, but there would be tariffs applied in both directions. And in the case of the European Union, we have to take at face value their claim that they would apply the common external tariff, which obviously is published and which we currently apply on their behalf for imports from third countries. What we would apply is the UK global tariff, which we published earlier last summer. And that sets out a range of tariffs and tariff treatments on many products, including in agri-food. Generally, they're a little bit lower than the common external tariff, but mainly due to sort of rounding down to sort of bands of 5% increments.
Okay, I'm finished.
Thank you. We move to the next lot of questions, which come from Emma Harper. Emma.
Thank you. Good morning, Secretary of State, and good morning, Mr Thompson. I'm interested in the new Trade and Agricultural Commission and how it will operate in Scotland. How does it support our Scottish farmers?
Well, the Trade and Agriculture Commission is something that farming unions right across the UK, the NFU here in England, FUW and NFU Scotland, all called for. And it was all really born out of a desire to have input into negotiations on future trade agreements. So the Trade and Agriculture Commission has all of those representatives on it, as well as some other additional technical expertise as well. And the amendments that we've now made to the Agriculture Bill and amendments that we intend to make shortly to the Trade Bill mean that before any trade agreement is laid before Parliament under the so-called CRAG process, before that happens, the Secretary of State must submit a report to Parliament giving an assessment of the SPS chapter and the animal welfare implications of any trade agreement, must set out a full account of what the trade agreement means for those standards and the impact of any trade agreement on our domestic producers. And before doing that, it will be required as well to consult a range of experts, including the Trade and Agriculture Commission. So the Trade and Agriculture Commission has effectively now been placed on a statutory footing with a statutory role to help inform the report that will be set before Parliament to inform decisions about whether or not to ratify any trade agreement.
I'm not sure, Secretary of State, you disappeared briefly. I'm not sure we got the final sentence. Are you back?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. I think the pictures, there's some problem with the picture. But Emma, do you want to follow up with your next question?
Sure, I've got a wee sup to that one as well. I'm interested in trade agreements and supporting the best food standards. And you spoke a little bit about pesticides and pesticide
I've lost
use.
Emma.
Oh.
Okay, hold on just a moment. Secretary of State, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, yes, but I'm afraid I lost Emma when she came back with a supplementary.
Right, she's gonna give it another bash.
Okay, thank you. I will give it another bash. You mentioned pesticides and looking at whether we should be able to further reduce pesticides in the UK. in comparing to EU and their usage. I'm also concerned about in trade agreements, how we look at supporting not bringing products into the UK that have been given higher levels of antibiotics, for instance, in pigs and beef, or even hormones, for instance, as well. It's a concern that has come across my casework when we're looking at trade deals with other countries. Antibiotic resistance is a concern of mine, but and avian leukosis has been brought to my attention as well, which is it's like a tumour in chickens that has to be cut off, for instance, and that was something that is a concern if that enters the food supply chain. So I'm interested in your comments about how do we support our UK consumers in having the ability to have access to the best, safest produced produce that comes into our country.
Yes, and I got the gist of that. I lost you in a minute, but I think I've understood it. I mean, the first thing to say is policy framework that we've set out in our new Agriculture Act for England very much envisages that we will pay financial incentives to livestock farmers to promote and enhance animal health and welfare, and along the way to reduce use of antibiotics. And we'll also be incentivising them to embrace integrated pest management and making financial rewards available to deliver that. And in the context of food imports, the SPS chapter of our trade agreements will look at these matters and will set down standards, particularly when it comes to MRLs, that's the maximum residue limits on all foods that are imported. And we've also been developing in our trade policy ideas around using a differential approach to the application of tariffs on imports, so that we can incentivise producers in overseas countries to match our standards on issues such as animal welfare.
Okay, thank you. And my second question is about what role does the UK government foresee for the Scottish Parliament in scrutinising the new trade agreements which impact our Scottish stakeholders as well? Because obviously Scotland can't negotiate the trade agreements that we rely on the UK government to do that for us.
Yes, I mean, I think what I would say is that these trade negotiations are a reserved matter, so ultimately the UK government leads on them. However, through the Trade and Agriculture Commission, we have Scottish stakeholders directly engaged in that process. And I think that's right, that we have groups like NFU Scotland and indeed, in other areas, we work very, very closely with the Scotch Whisky Association and the whisky industry, which is one of our most successful exports around the world. Very important that we have them engaged in these discussions. But of course, as well, when we get towards the end state of these trade agreements, the Department for International Trade will also be reaching out and engaging with the devolved administrations as well on what is proposed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Secretary of State. We'll move on to the next lot of questions, which come from Stuart Stevenson. Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. And Secretary of State, the fish catching industry is probably the industry in the UK and certainly in Scotland that most obviously has something substantial to gain from Brexit through gaining substantially increased access to catching opportunities, and indeed with our becoming a coastal state being entirely responsible for what happens in our waters. But I want to just start with the processing industry, which is a rather larger and more diffuse industry, and perhaps in particular how we can make sure that we're able to export in a way not tariffs, although that's from delays, because so many of our products in this sector have to reach the market very rapidly indeed. And that's particularly true for live animals coming from many of our small communities around the coasts of Scotland, things like langoustines and scallops and so on and so forth. So how are negotiations going to make sure that we have a smooth passage for these live animals to market in the EU, which is one of our most economically important markets.
Yes, and we've done a lot of work in this area. And in terms of the Scottish fishing industry, most of the pelagic stocks, so mackerel and herring, they're often transported frozen, and so the timeliness is a bit less critical. Certainly on a lot of the whitefish stocks in particular, and shellfish especially, the timeliness of deliveries is absolutely critical. So what we have done to assist in this is last year we had an agreement with French authorities that they would not implement checks on fish products arriving from the UK at Calais. Instead, lorries carrying fish would be diverted directly to the fish market at Boulogne, and any checks, whether that's customs checks or SPS checks, checks of EHCs and so on, would take place at the market as the fish arrive. So that's one measure that we agreed to speed up the passage of these lorries. The other thing that we've done, which is unique to the fishing industry, or the exception of scaled chicks as well, is we have developed a system where if Operation Brock is triggered, i.e. if there is severe disruption at the border, and we have queues of lorries because ferries are delayed and so forth, then we have developed a protocol that would enable us to fast stream through those lorries. We estimate there's around 80 or so lorries a day, more than half of them from Scotland. But those lorries carrying fresh fish that need to get to market will be fast-tracked through the system to ensure they arrive on time.
Well, can I very much welcome what you've just said, although draw your attention to recent correspondence from the industry and food processors generally about quite substantial remaining concerns they have. Some of these are around labelling. You referred to frozen pelagic fish. At the moment, the pelagic processors don't know what the label is on the outside of their batch frozen. And I'm not asking about that. That's a matter for another day. Now, clearly, as we regain control of our waters, and therefore in a position to control who gets access to our waters and in what conditions, that will be a vital part of the trade-offs between getting the kind of access we need to markets and European fishermen getting access to our waters. How are we going to see the access for foreign vessels controlled? Colleagues will ask about how we do the negotiations in future in details. I'm not asking about that. Just how in the negotiations is the trade-off between these two potentially conflicting negotiating objectives going to be pursued?
Well, we tend to find when we talk to processors, I think it's fair to say that the shellfish sector would feel that they probably have at least to gain from the recovery of our control over our waters, since these are not generally quota species, and because they export quite a lot, they do have a concern around tariffs and potential barriers to trade. But when we talk to the larger processors, that is those that are processing often large amounts of imported demersal whitefish from countries like Norway and Iceland, and indeed landings from UK and Scottish vessels, part of that. The message generally we get from them is don't sell out the catching sector on our behalf. And it's quite refreshing, really. I wish we had more sectors of our economy that took that view. Their view is that they would be able to cope with a few tariffs if that's what it took. But actually, this is a great opportunity for our country. We should take back control of our waters. We should use our ability to control access to rebalance quota sharing arrangements and rectify some of those historic wrongs. And, the current sharing arrangements under the Common Fisheries Policy are profoundly unfair to UK fishermen, and we've got an opportunity now to address that.
Thank you. Finally, Secretary of State, I think that's a correct assessment. But of course, one of the things that has greatly concerned the catching sector has been, well, getting staff, and that's true of the processing sector, but more fundamentally that we've not been able to apply our Scottish rules from Marine Scotland to foreign vessels. And I take it you will confirm that any vessels that will be fishing in our waters will have to comply with local rules and will be accountable to Marine Scotland and the equivalent bodies throughout the United Kingdom.
Yes, so there will be two ways that this happens. First of all, we will be able, through the annual negotiations that take place with either the EU or Norway or indeed Faroes, we will be able to place licence conditions on every individual foreign vessel that seeks access to our waters. And that will enable us to, as well as putting catch limits on and limits on the types of stocks they could catch, but also enable us to require certain technical measures as well. And the second area where this will be relevant is within our exclusive economic zone. If we take spatial measures, that is, for instance, a closure or a restriction on a particular gear type in a particular area, that will apply to foreign vessels coming into our waters as well, in a way that, that doesn't apply now under the Common Fisheries Policy.
Thank you, Secretary of State.
Thank you.
We're going to move on to the next questions from Angus MacDonald. But before I do so, if I could just gently remind committee members that short questions hopefully will elicit succinct responses, which means that everyone will get in, and then I won't have to face you all after the committee because you all haven't had the chance to get the questions you want. So a gentle reminder, if I may, and the next questions are from Angus MacDonald. Angus.
Okay, thank you, Convener, and I will be as succinct as I possibly can be. Good morning, Secretary of State. You'll be aware, Mr Eustace, of comments made by Treasury Advisor Dr Tim Leunig, who advises Rishi Sunak, who said the food sector was not critically important to the country's economy and that agriculture and fisheries certainly isn't. So taking that into account and given the relative importance of fisheries for Scotland, will the Scottish Government and industry representatives be at the table in future international fisheries negotiations, and what scrutiny role do you foresee for UK parliaments, including the Scottish Parliament, in relation to these negotiations?
I think if Tim Leunig were on this call, he would point out that although I think in the note he had said that they might be small statistically for the UK economy as a whole, they were incredibly important industries in some areas. And because we had a large land mass, we needed to make sure it was well managed. So I think if you look at the full context of what he said, it was a bit different. But look, he's just an advisor who's there to sort of provoke discussion on things. Government policy is very clear that both the fishing industry and the agriculture industry are incredibly important to our country. And we've always had an approach in annual fisheries negotiations of taking a UK-wide delegation. Fergus Ewing and prior to that, Richard Lockhead go with me, or whoever the fisheries minister is, each and every year, and are very much part of that UK delegation. And in the past, when we've gone into the trilateral negotiations with the EU presidency and the Commission, ministers from each part of the UK have been by my side in those negotiations. So we've always had an approach that very much involves every part of the UK. This is particularly important, obviously, for Scotland, since more than half of our fishing industry is in Scotland. And also Scottish officials like Alan Gibb work very, very closely with DEFRA fisheries officials as well.
Okay, that's good to know, Secretary of State. We also know that a greater share of quota for UK vessels is a key aim of the fisheries negotiations. And you've kind of touched on that already with your response to Stuart Stevenson. However, fisheries experts have cautioned against unilateral quota setting that could lead to overfishing. So how will you approach negotiations to avoid provoking unsustainable unilateral quota setting?
Well, the key three variables in any annual fisheries negotiation where you're not in the common fisheries policy is, first of all, the total allowable catch. In other words, the overall size of the cake for a stock. Secondly, it's mutual agreements on access, who has access to which waters to catch which stocks. And then finally, it's the sharing arrangement. In other words, who gets what slice of the cake. And in the final analysis, what tends to happen is there tends to be an argument over sharing, which is understandable. And the way those arguments are flushed out is by saying to countries, if you think you have those fish in your waters, well, catch them in your own waters. And it is at that point that the countries that actually depend on access to another's waters in order to catch the fish that they would like, at that point, they have to accept different type of sharing arrangement. And that is the general dynamic of any fisheries negotiation. We absolutely want to avoid unilateral setting of quotas. But it would be very difficult for the EU to do that, given their very high dependency on access to UK waters.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Okay, briefly, Peter Chapman.
Convener, I just wish to follow up. You know, how confident are you that we are in a position to police their new rules and police these EU vessels who will be less than pleased when they are told they can catch less in our waters? It's important that we are able to police these rules and regulations so that they aren't flouted in future. How confident are you that we have the ability to do that?
We are confident we can do that. The greatest challenges would probably come in the Channel and in the southern North Sea. So it's a particular challenge for the MMO and for the English fisheries authorities. Overall, we've roughly increased our enforcement capacity by about fivefold, in that we have brought on additional offshore patrol vessels from the Royal Navy, but delayed the decommissioning of the old ones, so we have additional capacity to draw on. We have also commissioned 2 additional commercial vessels to assist in enforcement. We've taken out contracts for 2 aerial surveillance aircraft, so that in the event that we don't have access to vessel monitoring data from the EU, well, then we'd have the ability to do it without access to that data. And we've also done a lot of training of additional staff in other agencies like the Border Agency, and worked out how we might be able to make use of the cutter vessels that the Border Agency have. In the context of Scotland, of course, it tends to be characterised by slightly larger vessels and smaller numbers of vessels in total. And it's already the case that Marine Scotland and the various commercial contracts they have do have quite a lot of experience, for instance, of policing agreements with the Faroes, where they're allowed to catch only a percentage of their mackerel quota in UK waters. So they have quite a high degree of experience already of policing these sorts of agreements.
I'm going to bring very briefly Richard Lyle into this, and then we'll move on to Emma Harper's question. Richard.
Yeah, Secretary of State, can you let me know, what do you do about the foreign firms that have already bought UK licences?
Well, what we've just done is issued a consultation on the economic link. I think this applies for England, but I know that the Scottish government are considering similar measures. And in essence, what we are saying is we're going to strengthen the economic link on those foreign-owned UK vessels so that they will be required to land at least 70% of their catch into UK ports. That means that they will be returning an economic benefit to the fish processing industry in those communities and creating new jobs in those areas. And if they fail to land 70% of their catch, well, then they will have to forfeit some quota in that year and contribute quota to the non-sector pool so that others can make use of that quota. So it's a much tougher economic link than went before, where they could largely get around it just by claiming they were employing a few UK crew.
Thank you.
And how do you stop any more licences being sold to foreign firms?
Well, I think really by having the writing on the wall that we will allocate quota in a different way. So what we've said in England is that the historic relative stability shares that people had, in order to provide some stability in the industry, we will continue to allocate along the FQA system, as it were, so that people didn't lose an entitlement that they had, and we will do that for the time being at least. But as we get new quota, additional quota that arrives as we depart from relative stability, well, we want to allocate that in a different way, not just dole it out based on historic use. And that could be a system where you tender it or license it to producer organizations and judge them on their success in making space for new entrants, judge it on their sustainability and their environmental track record, so that there's a reward that comes to those producer organizations and their members, who approach fishing in a really sustainable way and try to make room for new entrants too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary of State. And now, Emma Harper, you have some questions. Emma.
Yep. Thank you, Convener, again. I think I got the answer to the first question earlier about standards, but I do have a specific question about the Internal Market Bill. Section 48 talks about regulation of distortive or harmful subsidies. And I wrote to the Scottish Government about whether Section 48 clause could potentially prevent the Scottish Government in future from providing targeted support to help the rural economy. And I know earlier Oliver Mundell mentioned ELFAS, and that's what comes to mind. So in response to me, the Cabinet Secretary said that the clause had the potential to prevent support being provided to Scotland's farmers, crofters and land managers, and agriculture is not mentioned in any exclusions. So it means that UK ministers could, if they decide, put in place new subsidy controls that would make payments unlawful. So I'm wondering, Minister, if you agree that this clause could directly impact on the Scottish Government's ability to provide support for the rural economy?
Well, I think that clause, I'm afraid I don't have the bill in front of me, but I think that clause is a reference really to, or foreshadows a possible kind of UK-wide state aid regime or subsidy regime. We're clear, and it's a sticking point in the negotiations, but we're not going to just bring across the EU state aid regime. We want to do something domestically. There will at some point be a need for some kind of state aid regime for the UK. I think that clause is very much linked to that. I have to say, in the context of agriculture, that's not the approach we envisage at all. Indeed, it's one of the 14 areas that we have been working with the Scottish Government and other devolved administrations as well on developing a framework agreement on agricultural support, so that we share ideas on what works and have memorandums of understanding that we won't support something in a way that is highly distortive of the market, but where we will respect and recognise the importance of each administration being able to pursue a policy that works for its own farmers.
And certainly a one-size-fits-all approach won't work for the whole of the UK because of the way that Scottish farming is so important for the rural economy, with our 85% less favoured areas. I have another question. It's Professor Michael Dugan suggested that England, by virtue of being the largest market in the UK, will effectively set standards on goods and services, and the other nations will have little choice but to align to ensure their manufacturers remain competitive and continue to operate in the other nations. What's your view on that?
I don't really, agree with that conceptually. I think what we're talking about here is mutual recognition. So it recognises that each part of the UK can pursue slightly different regulations and diverge. But what it can't do is then, frustrate the workings of the internal market. I think you have to ask the question, is this a new concept? And the answer is no, it's not remotely new. Indeed, it's what we've had really as a principle within the European Union for decades. It's already the case, if I give you an example, that the European Union has a position that if a genetically modified crop is authorized for use by the European Commission, then it's not possible for any member state to ban the sale of products that might be produced using that GM technology. But it also allows each part of the European Union, and indeed under our devolved settlement, each part of the UK, to decide whether or not they will allow those to be cultivated. And so it is already the case that some 5 years ago, England said that it would, in principle, be willing to allow the cultivation of some GM crops if they were safe and had been approved. Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland decided that as a point of political principle, they wouldn't. But under either of those scenarios, if Spain or France or another country had cultivated those crops, there would have been no lawful way to prevent them being sold in Scotland.
Thank you. Emma, I think you're concluded on that. Or
Yes,
you,
yep.
OK, we'll go to the next questions from Angus MacDonald. Angus.
Okay, thanks again, Convener. Secretary of State, for clarification and for the record, under the provisions in the Internal Market Bill, would a good imported into England that complies with the required legal standards to be placed on the market in England have to be allowed to be sold on the Scottish market?
Well, if a good were imported, then it would be under an international agreement that the UK government would have concluded. And yes, in that scenario, those goods would obviously be able to be sold throughout the UK internal market. The specific point, though, is if a good is produced under a regulatory standard set in, say, Scotland, there would be no way that England could prevent that Scottish producer selling those goods on the English market.
Okay, that clarification's helpful. As you'll be aware, this committee's remit deals with policy areas where there has been extensive harmonisation across the EU. This is the case for agriculture, fisheries, the wider food and drink industry, and related and underpinning remits such as the environment. As such, it's been recognised that there's a need for common approaches to maintain the UK internal market, extensive intergovernmental work between the four governments of the UK. So what's the role of UK parliaments in this process, and can you tell us how they'll be able to effectively scrutinise and influence intergovernmental agreements and processes?
Well, the framework agreements that we have been very much negotiated, mainly at official level, actually, between each of the four administrations, and they are generally speaking a memorandum of understanding or a concordat, if you like, on how to approach things. So, in the space of agriculture, it would all be about setting up a market review group so that we together ensure that what each administration is doing doesn't cause huge distortions in the market. And it's all about sharing experiences of different policy innovations. So I think it's fair to say that England probably at the moment intends to start to diverge from the legacy basic payment scheme faster than the other parts of the UK. I suspect we will get some things right. We might get some things wrong. Scotland may make a change more cautiously, but if England does something that is particularly successful, I suspect Scotland would adopt that. If we did something that meant it didn't work and I ended up with egg on my face, well, I'm sure the Scottish government would decide not to follow that. And I think we would see this happening across our family of nations in the UK, that we would learn from one another, as we do now on some devolved policy areas like animal welfare. In some cases, Scotland would probably follow England and vice versa. In some cases, we might follow Wales if they do something that works. And so I think there would be a kind of natural convergence that came about through a willingness to pursue good ideas. I think that's what the most likely outcome would be, particularly with each administration engaging in these frameworks.
Okay, thanks. Just for further clarification, though, is it possible that the Internal Market Bill will indirectly constrain the role of the Scottish Parliament? Now, we've just discussed GM crops or GM food, but for example, were the Scottish Parliament to disagree with an approach taken jointly between UK and devolved governments in a devolved area and request that Scottish ministers bring forward separate legislation for Scotland, is it conceivable that a separate Scottish approach would not be legally permitted?
I don't think it would be under the. I mean, with the exception of one or two areas with sort of high risk products and chemicals and things where we recognise there's a difference. Generally speaking, the principle behind mutual recognition is you can have differences about the production standards that you have and accept that that's a devolved matter, but you can't use that as a means of frustrating mutual recognition. I think I'd make the point as well, is that position one that gives the Scottish Parliament more or less power than it has now as a member of the European Union? And unequivocally, the answer is it gives it more power because obviously under the various EU directives and harmonisation and the plethora of delegated acts and implementing acts coming from the European Commission, no UK administration, not England, not UK, not Scotland, we don't have the legal right to diverge and differ from EU law in those occupied policy spaces. Freedom, Amber.
I think we got sorry, Angus, I think we got the gist of that. There was a little bit there where we went quiet, but Angus, follow it up with another question by all means.
No, I certainly got the gist of it, but there's certainly a debates to be had on that issue. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much, Angus. We'll go to the next questions, which are from Oliver Mundell. Oliver.
Thank you, Convener. The Scottish Government's obviously introduced its own legislation to give ministers here the power to keep pace with EU law in devolved areas, notwithstanding my substantial concerns about that approach and what it means for Scottish agriculture. Can you confirm that there's nothing in the Internal Market Bill which will limit Scottish Government's ability to keep pace with EU law in relation to devolved matters?
No, I mean, there would be nothing, I think, to prevent the Scottish Government for doing that insofar as it's consistent with the devolved settlement. And I know there was a similar bill, I think, in a previous session that there was some legal dispute over. I'm not sufficiently familiar with the precise details of this bill to know whether that is or is not fully consistent with the devolution settlement we've got, and I'm sure there'll be other lawyers who would who would consider that. But broadly speaking, yes, it's open to the Scottish Government to slavishly follow EU law if that is what they wish to do. I suspect it won't be strategy that can be maintained in the long term, because it is only a matter of time before the EU would bring forward policy proposal that would be manifestly against Scottish interests, and it then does become a moot point of do you elevate the pursuit of EU law above the interests of Scotland? And I think that would leave probably any Scottish government in quite a difficult quandary.
No, I'm pleased to hear you highlight that point, because I'm particularly concerned on things like glyphosate, which is extremely important to Scottish farmers, that by keeping pace with EU law, we might end up missing out on many of the benefits that Brexit's brought. But that's more of a comment, Convener, and I'll let questioning move on to others.
Okay, thank you. And the next questions are from Richard Lyle. Richard.
Thank you, Secretary of State. What, if any, changes do the UK government plan to make to the state aid framework related to this committee's remit?
Well, the state aid framework is very much something that I know colleagues in Bays are considering. But we obviously have a reference point already in the context of agriculture. We know what's required under the WTO system, the WTO rules, where you have a system of aggregate market support with the so-called green box, blue box, and amber box. We know roughly what the UK's allocation will be under that aggregate market support under our new WTO schedule. So that gives us a starting point. And I think broadly, what we would seek to achieve is an ability for all of the devolved administrations to pursue policies that work for their own landscape and their own farm structures, their own farmed environment, but obviously, to prevent a situation where you could get, anti-competitive subsidies that would be deeply unfair on another part of the UK. If the English government were to say it was going to sort of make a, £200 a head payment to farmers in Cumbria, and Scotland weren't able to do the same, well, that wouldn't be fair on sheep farmers in Scotland. So I think we all understand, and we'll be seeking to, agree this principally through the frameworks, but, ultimately it may be addressed through a state aid regime as well. We'd need to have an understanding that there's freedom to do whatever works, provided it doesn't cause, huge market distortions within the internal market. Richard
seems to have disappeared. I think he may have had an internet connection problem. So what we'll do is we will move on, and I will try and bring Richard back in when he reconnects. So I'm going to go to the Deputy Convener now to allow her to ask her questions. Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary and Mr Thompson. Over the past few months, or it seems like ages, this committee has scrutinised a large number of UKSIs, which either refer to the common frameworks, as indeed you have already during this discussion, or in areas where the need for common frameworks has been noted. Now, my understanding is that the Scottish Government, along with other devolved governments, have in good faith participated in the common frameworks process since 2017 indeed, and believe that this process was designed to manage policy differences on the basis of agreement and is founded on the respect for devolution. Indeed, I think this was a specific tool that was jointly designed by the devolved governments and the UK government for the task of managing the practical regulatory and market implications of the UK leaving the EU. So can I ask you, what ongoing role do you foresee for the UK Parliaments in scrutinising the operation of common frameworks?
Well, I think the common frameworks are more a matter between the devolved administrations, and obviously each will raise and address questions raised by their respective parliaments. The important thing to state is that none of those frameworks have legislative force. They are, as you point out, memorandums of understanding between the devolved administrations on modes of working and sharing best practice and notifying one another of changes they might make. That we've set them out in 14 different areas. It ranges from, animal health and welfare right through to fisheries management and chemicals and pesticides and fertilizer regulations and many more besides. We discussed it at the interministerial group last week, and they're going to be considered further on our next meeting in December before being formally endorsed by all of the administrations. So we have worked very closely with the devolved administrations on these. They are, agreements on modes of working and memorandums of understanding, rather than having any legal force or legal weight, and they don't actually change the essence and the overall position as far as the devolution settlement's concerned.
I think you kind of underplay some of them. I mean, when, for example, do you expect the detail of the framework on agricultural support to be available, and what do you expect it to contain?
Well, it'll be available, as I said, before the end of the year, but it'll basically be looking at the agricultural policy that we have that replaces the previous common agricultural policy. And it's a non-legislative framework. It'll be looking at UK collaboration. We've been working on a proposal to set up a UK agricultural marketing monitoring group across all of the devolved administrations to work out the impacts, and a policy coordination group as well, so that we can share best practice with one another. But it's very much around advisory agreements and joint market monitoring, so that we work together to address any issues that might arise.
I think some of my colleagues will come on to funding, which of course agricultural support is all about. Your government's proposals for the internal market potentially undermine the framework process by removing the incentive for the governments to agree ways of aligning and managing differences. So how do you envisage that common frameworks and the provision of the internal market bill will work together, taking into account the distinct needs of Scottish agriculture?
Well, I think the principle of mutual recognition, which is the essence of the UK Internal Markets Bill, will mean that we have coherence within the UK internal market, and that barriers to trade within the four nations cannot be frustrated. And the way that the frameworks will supplement that is on regulatory coordination. And that's obviously very different to what we had in the EU. In the EU, you had regulatory harmonisation, where the Scottish Parliament and the UK Parliament were disempowered under the 1972 Act, and where the European Commission directly regulated on our behalf, and where it was unlawful for us to legislate in an area that was occupied by the European Union. What we're going into now is a much looser system, where the Scottish Parliament will be empowered and able to make its own regulations in a way that it wasn't previously. So will the UK Parliament on behalf of both the UK and England, depending on whether a matter's devolved. And the way that we will manage those differences is not by centralisation and harmonisation, but by regulatory coordination.
So just finally, do you see an ongoing open-ended need for the framework process continuing?
I think so. I mean, we've set up these 14 areas which set out ways of working. My experience of concordats of this nature in the past, and we've had one, for instance, on fisheries and managing vessel licensing. Occasionally issues arise and they need to be revised and looked at again, and we often will consult industry on those sorts of changes. So I think this is a very good starting point. But I wouldn't rule out the fact that as we get into this, we might look at ways of refining those ways of working.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Secretary of State. The next questions are from Colin Smith. Colin.
Good morning, Secretary of State. Good morning, Mr Thompson. Can I turn to the issue of the replacement for EU funding? Secretary of State, given how extensive and indeed vital EU funding is to agriculture, fisheries and the wider rural economy in Scotland, can I ask, will the Scottish Government make the equivalent amount of funding as previously provided by EU CAP available to the Scottish Government?
Yes, so we have a manifesto commitment that we would spend the same on agriculture in each of the devolved administrations, in cash terms, as we did at the point of leaving the EU. So the SPS payments, also BPS payments, those Pillar 1 payments, were effectively set at the exchange rate that pertained between sterling and the euro in December 2019. And that gives us the baseline for payments going forward. And also it covers the Pillar 2 payments. So Scotland will be having £595 million per year as we go forward through this Parliament. And I know there's been questions raised about some of these issues, but it's important to recognise that the exchange rate, after we voted to leave the European Union, adjusted quite considerably in favour of agriculture. So the payment rates on direct payments are some 20% higher than they would have been had the 2015 rates been used. It's also the case that the EU themselves, since the UK's obviously left and they're losing the money that we paid in, they've had to take a difficult decision to cut spending on agriculture by 10%. So taken together, I think it's the case that farmers right across the UK are better off out of the European Union than they would have been inside, because had we not voted to leave and had there been a cut in the EU budget, they would be receiving considerably less money as EU members.
Obviously, Secretary of State, EU funding to Scotland goes beyond, for example, Pillar 2 payments. And across the UK, we have a number of successful EU-funded programmes that are administered by devolved governments, whether that's from EU structural funds or the LEADER programme, for example. They all come to an end, but there does appear to be a lack of detail over what will replace them, partly due to the lack of clarification on funding. So Secretary of State, can I ask when we'll see details for the replacement for EU structural funds, the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and how will that operate in Scotland?
Well, I think you will see more details soon. Obviously, we have the spending review today that sets out an approach in a number of areas. And I think that once those financial envelopes for the current year are set, it will be possible at that point for Robert Jenrick, my colleague in MHCLG, and Alok Sharma in Bays to say a bit more about how they see that fund operating. DEFRA has obviously been engaged in that discussion because the previous rural development funds under IFRIT, principally the LEADER fund, it is envisaged that would become a strand and a tier of the Shared Prosperity Fund in future, unlike the other agricultural productivity grants. So I think you will hear more about that in due course, but I'm afraid you have to wait a little bit longer. Might want to get Robert Jenrick before your committee once he's set out their thinking.
I'm sure that invitation will be in the post, Secretary of State. But just to be clear, will the UK Shared Prosperity Fund be, and also the EU cap replacement, will that be administered by the Scottish Government?
Well, we've obviously set out a position on the agriculture fund, the cap replacement, if you like, and yes, that's going to be administered by the Scottish Government. Look, there's discussions about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, exactly how that will work, I'm afraid you're going to have to, wait until that position's been finalised and MHCLG set out a bit more detail about how they intend to approach these things.
Let's hope that soon, Secretary of State. Just finally, can I ask, does the UK Government have any plans to develop a replacement for the European Maritime Fisheries Fund?
Yes, there will be a replacement for the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, and we will be, again, saying a bit more about that now that the spending review's concluded. We'll be saying more about that a little later this year.
Thanks, Colin. Now, Richard Lyle disappeared halfway through the questions he was asking, so I want to bring him back in before I move on to the next question from Peter Chapman. So Richard Lyle first and then Peter Chapman.
My apologies, Convener. My apologies, Secretary of State. My Wi-Fi went down. Can I ask, have you asked for extra money for agriculture from the Chancellor to be announced this afternoon? And do you agree with DEFRA's comment that Treasury's suggestions does DEFRA agree with Treasury's suggestions that current farm payments do not represent value for the taxpayer?
Well, on your first point, yes, as part of the spending review process, obviously we asked the Treasury for the sum of money that we committed in our manifesto to make during the course of this Parliament, and anticipate that we that when the Chancellor talks this afternoon, there will be some favourable news on that front. On your latter question, yes, we do agree that the current payments are poor value for money. I think area-based payments don't make a great deal of sense. They subsidise land ownership and land tenure. Tends to mean that the largest payments go to the wealthiest landowners, whereas perhaps some of those businesses that would benefit from more support get the smallest payments. It can inflate land rents and inflate input costs. Area payments can lead to a situation where people are not really particularly actively farming the land, but coast and just collect the basic payment on that land. So I think for a multitude of reasons, an area-based subsidy makes very little sense. It's a subsidy on land ownership or tenure, and land is a limited resource and doesn't need subsidising. So what we intend to do in England is to progressively move away from that, and instead redirect payments to invest in technology, reduce costs, invest in research and development, invest in the environment, support farmers to farm more sustainably, enhance animal welfare and animal health outcomes. We just think that's a better way to target these significant funds.
So really that is your choice, but will the proposal to reserve state aid as part of the internal market affect the Scottish Government's ability to determine what support can be provided for the Scottish rural economy, including agriculture post-Brexit? Or a devolved nation, as a devolved nation, can we take our own decisions, re-spend, and as you said, I think previously, have the freedom to do so?
Well, I think the starting point is that, yes, Scotland would have the freedom to do so. And indeed, one of the first things that I did when I became farming minister was lobby quite hard.
Secretary of State, I don't know if you can still hear me. Sorry, we lost you halfway through. I lobbied quite hard, I think was the last thing I heard.
I will pick up where I left off. We lobbied quite hard on behalf of NFU Scotland to ensure that we could have a higher rate of coupled support on the sheep sector, because the argument is with such wide-ranging landscapes in Scotland, an area-based regional sort of approach didn't really work, and so retention of a coupled support was quite important to make sense of the CAP in Scotland. So it would be open to Scotland to pursue those sorts of policies. But the only point I'd make is, as I said earlier, if it was so great that actually Scotland was paying a subsidy of sort of £300 per sheep, and that was causing major dislocation and unfairness in the internal market, well, obviously there'd need to be some sort of state aid regime that would pick that up, and it might equally work the other way round. So I think what we want is to use the agricultural policy framework in the first instance to coordinate our differences, but have a starting point that there's freedom for each administration to pursue policies that work for them. And only if it starts to become a major distortion in the internal market would we see a state aid regime kicking in.
Lastly, can I ask how much you have asked for the Chancellor to give you extra?
Richard, I think...
Well, it's less about extra. It's consistent with the manifesto commitment. But as I said earlier, the allocation that amounts to for Scotland is £595 million a year.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. Thank you.
Richard, you, as always, you take the questioning right to the next level as well. So thank you for that. Peter Chapman, you have some questions. And then I'm going to come to Emma Harper and Oliver Mundell, who've indicated they want to ask some additional questions. So Peter Chapman first.
Secretary of State, there's real worry at the moment as to how our fruit harvest is going to be picked next year. We know that we need some 70,000 seasonal agricultural workers across the UK to pick the fruit, and something like 10,000 of these need to come to Scotland. And at the moment, we have no clarity as to where these people are going to come from. Can you give us some idea how we are going to be able to pick our fruit in this coming season?
Yes, I mean, the analysis we've done suggests that there's probably in the region of 70,000 roles, but actually sometimes, an individual will start the year picking daffodils in Cornwall before moving to pick soft fruit in Kent and perhaps ending up in, Aberdeen picking raspberries. So sometimes the individuals move around. And so the estimate's actually probably lower than 70,000 in terms of the total number of actual individuals. But we've been working with the Home Office closely on this. We're obviously in an environment where unemployment is probably set to rise, sadly, as a result of the coronavirus. And many of those jobs affected will be people who are working in the hospitality sector. Sometimes they will be, Polish or Lithuanian. Sometimes they would have worked in the fields. And there'll be people who are used to doing hard graft. And we need to make sure that in our future policy, we make sure that we've kept space for some of those people to take some of this work, while acknowledging that it's not always easy to get British people to do these seasonal jobs. But we will be saying more shortly about the scale of the seasonal agricultural workers scheme for next year. We do recognise, and it's recognised by the Migration Advisory Committee, that horticulture is a special case, and that we therefore need a bespoke seasonal workers scheme.
Well, I'm delighted to hear you say that, because this spring, for instance, there were hundreds of thousands of workers furloughed, and our growers did make a real attempt to get them to come and pick fruit, and with very limited success, I would say. Many folks said they had thousands of applications, but they actually ended up with just a handful of people at the end of the season that they've actually stuck the job right through. So I wouldn't rely too much on that. The other issue, of course, is that's a seasonal workers issue, and they need to be here for 6 months or so. But it's also important to realise that in the northeast, for instance, in fish processing factories, something like 70% of the staff are from the EU, and there's a real concern there that there'll be a huge shortage of people to process the extra fish that we hope to catch. So is there any thoughts as to how that can be addressed going forward?
Well, I think in two ways. First of all, a lot of those East Europeans working in food processing jobs, and it's particularly when it comes to meat processing or fish processing, where there's a high degree of reliance on East European labour. And many of those will have gone for settled status since they're in full-time roles, and will have, in many cases, family that are settled here, children that are at school here. So I think there will be, a degree of resilience for those sectors in that many of their staff will have gone for settled status. In addition to that, the Home Office are doing a review at the moment on the shortage occupation list, and are looking at a range of jobs and professions and skilled and semi-skilled jobs where there's a shortage. And I know that some of the roles around fishing were highlighted by the Migration Advisory Committee as being something that should be considered and looked at as that list is reviewed and extended.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Emma, I think you have a brief supplementary.
Thank you, Convener. It is just 2 points, and obviously could be responded to at a later time, but the Northern Ireland Protocol is a concern for me because of Belfast and Larne, and there's Port of Warrenpoint now, but through the Port of Cairnryan in the southwest of Scotland. But there's issues around the staffing requirements. So apparently 25 vets are needed for each Larne site, or for Larne and Belfast. There's a massive amount of Department of Agriculture staffing increased needs in additional to the 25 vets. There's 12 administrative staff, there's 30 environmental health officers. So, and I could go into more detail, but whether we get a free trade agreement or not, I'm not aware that Northern Ireland are ready yet, so it'd be interesting to hear about that. But there is also a particular issue about sheep movement from Scotland to Northern Ireland because of the European health certificates that will be required as part of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the sheep scrapie monitoring scheme that happens in Scotland will then have to come into play for any sheep moving between Scotland and Northern Ireland, so whether they go south or not. So I'm interested in whether a derogation would be considered, because that's what some of the sheep farmers are asking for, so that they can be prepared and be more ready for what health certificate is required.
Emma, if that was a short question, I'm not looking for a long one from anyone, but Secretary of State, and then we'll go to Oliver Mundell.
Okay. Well, I'll try and be short, but it is a complex issue, the Northern Ireland Protocol. I mean, the committee will recall that in the last Parliament, we were trying to square the circle on a very difficult conundrum, which is how do we take the UK out of the EU and the EU single market without the need for a border on the island of Ireland? And having gone round and round on this, we concluded that in the end, the best way to do it was to agree that we would put some checks on entry points, particularly in Larne and in Belfast, for goods going from GB to Northern Ireland as a way of resolving this. Of course, that's created challenges of its own. For instance, supermarkets potentially requiring quite large numbers of export health certificates, certain products where there's not an export health certificate that can be issued at the moment. We're working through these in the joint committee process to iron out the specifics of how the Northern Ireland Protocol will work. And I know that certainly Michael Gove and other departments are in discussion with the Scottish Government as well about Cairnryan, about what might be required there, in particular for goods that originate in the Irish Republic but travel through Northern Ireland. So these are complex, difficult issues, but I can reassure you that we're seeking to address them.
Emma, is that you? Do you want?
It's just the sheep scrapie scheme might be something to take in a letter or something like that.
Okay, Secretary of State, if you don't have the answer to that, we're happy to take that in a letter form. Yes, happy to take that. But I think it's almost certainly the case that it will be on the SPS regulations, and therefore on the list of requirements and things that would have to be checked in common with a number of others. But we will take that specific point away. Thank you very much. Oliver Mundell.
I done. Convener Peter Chapman covered the issue in more detail, and I feel I got the answer I was looking for.
Okay, that's fine. So I'm not sure. Richard Lyle, I think you've got another question, have you?
Yes, just to follow on what I was asking earlier, Secretary of State, sorry to come back to this. Can I clarify, in line with your manifesto commitment, will the Scottish level of funding stay the same as we receive from the EU funding bloc as we move forward for 2021-2025?
Well, it'll be the same in cash terms as it was at the point at which we left the European Union, and that's the point that was set in 2019. So on some measures it'll be higher, because if you were to take the rate of payment at the beginning of the last financial perspective on the exchange rate pertaining at the time. It would have been some 20% lower. It's higher than the EU going forward because the EU's cut its budget by 10%, but it is basically the same in cash terms per year going forward for the duration of this Parliament. And of course, the thing that sometimes causes confusion here is this is our spending reviews tend to work on a 5-year cycle. The EU's work on a sort of 7+3 cycle. So spending commitments from the EU can run for a full decade, whereas our spending review periods focus on 5 years. And this is where some people get confused. You can't compare them directly because they refer to different time periods.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. That's me, Convener. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think that concludes all the questions that I have notified to me from the remote members and those around the room. So I'd like to thank you, Secretary of State, for coming in and giving evidence to the committee today. I'd also like to thank Mark Thompson, who sat very quietly and was not called in to contribute, but we are grateful for you being there, ready to contribute should you have had to. And we'll now move on to the next item on our agenda, which is the European Union Withdrawal Act. We have received a consent notification in relation to one UK statutory instrument as detailed on the agenda. This instrument is being laid in the UK Parliament in relation to the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. The notification explains that despite the dispute over the import-export controls reservation, the Scottish ministers are content for the changes in this field to be made by UKSI because they are technical changes with limited impact in Scotland. Does any member of the committee wish to make a comment on this? No one does. So my question is does the committee agree to write to the Scottish Government to confirm it is content for consent for the UKSI referred to in the notification to be given? We are agreed. And therefore, we are, just before we move into private session, I'd just like to mention one thing, if I may, is that the committee is always ably supported by our clerking team. And Deborah Cook, who has been a member of the clerking team for some time, has actually moving away from the team. So I'd like to just thank her on behalf of all of the committee members for the work that she's put in. So would you thank her on our behalf and make sure she gets a copy of the official record to show that we have thanked her. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to move into private session.